Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, to this roundtable on the Austrian elections of 15th of October. We'll discuss both what's had been going on, why the election result is as it is, but we'll also focus a lot on the consequences for Austria, but also in a wider European setting. Before I introduce our guest speaker and the respondents, let me just say that in many ways the Austrian election outcome was probably unsurprising. The pollsters were surprisingly accurate in their predictions. The result is, as you know, a rather substantial win for the Conservative Party under its new leader Sebastian Kurz, then almost tied outcome for the Social Democrats in second place and the right-wing Freedom Party in third place. And the three smaller parties around the 4% threshold that it takes to get into parliament. And one of the parties, the Green Party, didn't make it. Two others, the Neos, a kind of center-liberal party, and Liste Pilz, a newly established party that had split away from the Greens, crossed that threshold. So this is what it looks like, and also in terms of the most likely outcome, in terms of composition of the next government, I think we are not up for any big surprises. Most observers predict that there will be a coalition between the Conservatives and the Freedom Party. Among the three larger parties, any possible coalition of two parties would cross the 51% threshold and secure a parliamentary majority for the government. But if you look in terms of policies, it's obvious that the Freedom Party and the Conservative Party are closest to each other. So political scientists would always predict this is the most likely coalition that's coming out of this. That's what was to be expected. But there were also really big surprises if you take a longer perspective looking at Austrian politics. One was the big comeback of the Conservative Party that had been the eternal junior partner in the grand coalition governments. The second one was, and we'll talk about this also, the self-destruction of the Green Party, which in European comparison was one of the most successful Green parties, getting 12% in the previous election, landing its biggest historic success ever with nominating the candidate that won the presidential election last year, and then not even making it into the parliament because they stayed just below the 4% threshold. So there's something to be explained there. And finally, it's also in a way surprising that the Freedom Party is again the likely junior partner in the next government, because we've had a government in exactly that composition already in the period 2000 to 2006. And among the Freedomites, not just among the Freedomites, I would say among large parts of the Austrian political elite generally, this is considered to be not a very good period and very good result. And the Freedomites eventually split up and were nearly, were cut down very substantially as a result of being a junior partner in that government. And now they're very eager to join again a government of the same composition in the role as junior partner. So all of this is stuff for discussion, but we also want to look, as I said initially, at the wider EU perspective. As you know, yesterday there were elections in one of Austria's neighboring countries, in the Czech Republic, and there was a rather substantive and also predicted victory of a populist party, ANO, under its leader Babiš. And so there is this question, will Austria be joining the Visegrad countries in the political landscape in Europe? That has been debated a bit. One of the most significant episodes in the election campaign was a TV debate between the leader of the Conservative Party and of the Freedom Party, in which the two seem to be competing who is the best friend of Viktor Orban. So there are worries, at least question marks, whether Austria will be moving into that camp. I won't say any more because that's not my role as a chair. We have a guest speaker who will kick it off with a statement of maybe 25, 30 minutes maximum. This is Reinhard Heinisch. I'm very pleased to welcome him here at the EUI. He has a chair in Austrian politics and comparative perspective at Salzburg University. He's also currently, I think, the president of the Austrian Political Science Association, and he was previously a professor of political science at Pittsburgh University. So he's half American, half Austrian, and very much in demand, especially among the global and English-speaking media as an expert on Austrian politics. He has also published a lot on populism in a comparative perspective. So there's a forthcoming handbook of populism that he edits together with Oskar Mazzolini and Christina Hotzbacher. He has published a book on the West European radical right that is called Understanding Populist Organization. And he has, if you don't have time to read the larger volumes, also a punchy and short piece in Foreign Affairs called Austria's Populist Puzzle that came out last year. So I won't go into more detail with Reinhard Heinisch's CV. It's quite substantive and I'm very happy to have him here. Let me just introduce briefly the other participants at the roundtable. So sitting next to me is Brigitte Laffan, whom I don't have to introduce to you, but maybe to the people watching the video. So she is the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies here at the EUI. And she has worked widely on European Union politics and institutions. And let me just mention, she has just established a new program at the Robert Schuman Center calling EGPP. You will have to get used to this acronym. It means European Governance and Politics Program. Brigitte will probably focus in her intervention after Reinhard Heinisch's statement on the rise of populism and the impact it has on the EU. Then we have here to my right Laila Hajabdu, who is an SBS alumna, working on issues of migration, refugees. Her thesis, which I had the good fortune to be the supervisor of, was on the politics of migrant integration at the city level. And Laila works both on public policies in comparative perspective and also analyzes the discourses and the framing of issues having to do with migrant integration and migration policy. She is now working, she's back at the EUI, and she is working at the Migration Policy Center with Andrew Geddes on his ERC project. Then next to her is Manes Weiskircher, another alumnus from the SPS department. Oh, not yet. Still to defend. Okay. So he pulled off the trick. He has already a postdoctoral position and has not defended yet. I thought you had. But he's now at Dresden Technical University, where he joined the program, a project called MEDEM, which is the Mercator Forum on Migration and Democracy. And he is there as a postdoc researcher, hopefully very soon postdoc. Manes has written a lot and researched on especially the left and radical right parties and social movements. Also, I think his thesis focuses on animal rights and how this topic is taken up both on the left side of the political spectrum, on the right side of the political spectrum. And he has also worked on the European Citizens Initiative, so it's a kind of social movement perspective on politics. And has published an article in Government and Opposition and in a Journal of Intercultural Studies. And finally, we have Sven Hutter, who is a former Max Weber Fellow, 2012-2013, was previously based at Munich University and has now come back again to the EUI as a research fellow in the ERC project run by Hans-Peter Griersi, which is called Political Conflict in Europe in the Shadow of the Great Recession, also known as PolCon. He's also involved in another ERC project at Freie University in Amsterdam. And his research is again on social movements, but also political parties, political participation and cleavage structures. So that was all in terms of my introduction. And now I give the floor to Reinhard and ask him to explain to us the puzzles of Austrian politics.
Sorry, thanks. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm particularly thankful to the organizers of the workshop, and I'd like to thank you for your interest, and thank you, Rainer, for the warm welcome. I'd like to provide you with a bit of context of the Austrian elections and then present some results from the national election study that we're engaged in. These are sort of based on raw data from the last wave before the election. And I try to end up with some implications and possible consequences, and then we head off to the other discussants, and hopefully we'll set the stage for the debate. The Austrian national election was in many ways significant for us for a number of reasons. It was a change election. It was quite clear. We had, if you will, 2 or 3 what the media dubbed alpha males making a play for the #1 spot for leadership. We've had pre-election changes in no fewer than 3 parties. There were the two mainstream parties, which was very new, had brand new party leaders, while the outsider party, the Freedom Party, had a well-worn, established leader who looked, significantly older, but he had been the young kid on the block previously, so there was a role reversal of sorts. For the first time, it was a clear difference in political agenda and direction the country was offered. So it was a choice election in terms of direction. It was an unprecedented number of parties running for office. There were 10 parties on the ballot that didn't run in all parts of the country at the same time, but nonetheless, it was quite a significant number of parties. There was one new party list, the split off from the Green Party, which sort of made it from foundation of the party into parliament in the span of about 12 weeks, which set a record in Austria. And we had a campaign overshadowed by allegations of dirty campaigning and mutual recriminations. At the end, the 2 major parties actually sued each other, so the lawsuits going back and forth. So in many ways, this was a very intense election in Austria. Sort of in terms of the background, when you look at the Austrian polling data going back several years, you can see that the data that the popularity of the parties, the party preference is rather stable, but it was one significant change in a very short time period. So for a long time, going back in the last legislative period, the Freedom Party was well ahead in the polls, leading the Conservatives and particularly the Social Democrats, with the Freedom Party in the low to mid-30s. Then it was a gradual decline and a rise of the Social Democrats, and then we have the sort of effect, the Kurz effect, the sort of leadership change in the Conservative Party. The color here is turquoise, and then again the pattern was very stable. So let me briefly walk you through this. So we have essentially a year and a half ago, the unpopular leader of the Social Democratic Party, Feynman, resigns. The current chancellor, still chancellor, Mr. Kern, takes the reins of the party, becomes the new chancellor, seen as it comes from outside. He was a manager of the Austrian National Railroad, was seen as a savior of the party. The party begins to search, is resurgent in the polls. Sort of around after Christmas, he presents a plan. Austria sort of seemed like he was making a bid for early elections. That triggers a whole host of political developments in Austria, but destabilizes inherently the Conservative Party internally and the coalition. Ultimately, that leads to a leadership change in the Conservative Party when on May 14th, Mr. Kurz, the millennial boy wonder of Austria and the Austrian foreign minister, takes the reins of the party and issues actually, in doing so, he issues an ultimatum to his party that he needs full powers, he needs more powers than previous party chairs have had in selecting his own team and in pushing the kinds of policies he wants to do. And that leads to this effect that the Conservative Party suddenly moves from about 20%, 21% to to sort of reach the low 30s, and it remains in the low 30s. So then the pattern, then again, is amazingly stable. So the Conservatives are in the around 33%. They're almost pegged. They're almost sort of pegged to that. While the Freedom Party and the Social Democrats are in the mid-20s, trading places with each other, and which has led to some of us joking that the campaign essentially was completely unnecessary, because no matter what happened in the campaign, the numbers didn't budge. The numbers remained essentially amazingly even across the board. Another development was that the Green Party, which was sort of on a downward slope, this descent became more precipitous after the leader of the Green Parties resigned. And there was a rival formation that split off from the Green Party that's the black line that comes in towards the end, that's actually been siphoning off a significant number of voters from the Green Party. So briefly about the Mr. Kurz, we can consider him a millennial change agent. It's not quite clear whether he will veer towards establishment conservatism or some sort of populism light. He's emphasized, when you look at party strategies, emphasizing versus blurring. He's emphasized a change, and he's posted it's time. It's not quite clear for what. He's also focused on restrictive immigration, arguing essentially that becoming an Austrian citizen, citizenship has to be selective, it has to be earned, and immigrants have to be adaptive, have to adapt culturally. He sort of embraced a pro-business and market liberal agenda. He's argued in favor of a differential welfare states, differential benefits. He has also clearly tried to keep his distance from the party establishment and the past government. He's refused to actually become the vice deputy chancellor, although that was offered to him when he became head of his own party, and he seemed to want to keep himself out of the daily minutiae of the everyday politics. On Europe, he's been sort of a bit all over the map. He's generally said Europe must do less but better. At the end of the campaign, he's engaged in a significant Islamophobic and xenophobic discourse. What is also noticeable is his new styling and a new style. You also notice that his party logo is almost absent from his posters. He used the same on his website for a long time. He sort of really tried to brand himself as this new person, sort of an Austrian version of Macron, en marche, while being sort of one of the longest serving members in the cabinet. He's been in the cabinet since 2011, and the party that he now leads, of course, En Marche, not a new party, but actually has been in government for 30 years. But nonetheless, he's been very successful in achieving this image change. He's been strategically very deft. He's had a slow rollout of candidates all throughout the summer. He's presented his program piecemeal, very slowly, and has been rather vague about the program. So it's very hard to pin him down where actually he stands. And his appeals have been emotional, rhetorical, and aesthetic primarily, rather than programmatic and substantive. Briefly to the Social Democrats, they were sort of Mr. Kern, the current chancellor, was an incumbent Social Democrat in a strategic dilemma, because he was essentially presiding over a divided party. And that division led to a series of strategic blunders in the campaign. It started out that when they tested it, it was quite clear that the Social Democrats were trailing in second place, and either it would be the Freedom Party would be ahead of the Social Democrats if the Conservatives had not had their change in leadership, but if the Conservatives would change to Mr. Kurz, again, the Social Democrats would find themselves in the second place. Now, they had a tried and tested strategy how to deal with the Freedom Party in first place, but they didn't have a good strategy of how to deal with the Conservatives, Mr. Kurz, in first place. So they tried various things, but in the end couldn't settle on a strategy, and they had an internal conflict between the the party apparatus and those who were loyal to the party and those who were loyal to Mr. Kern himself, and there were two different visions. Kern also had the problem that they failed to define the issues early. So in the beginning of the campaign, the Social Democrats were debating publicly on whether or not to have a coalition with the Freedom Party rather than defining the issues. So the issues were defined essentially for them. And in the end, they were switching back and forth between an issues campaign and an incumbent campaign. Also within the party felt that Kern was not sufficiently attractive to the base, so they tried to humanize him by, first of all, they rolled out some very controversial posters that ended up being debated as particularly by people who were the likely target group in terms of their messages. Then they tried to have Mr. Kern deliver pizzas or present him in lederhosen in an effort to humanize and make him sort of more approachable, which is a noticeable difference from the conservatives who actually presented Mr. Kurz as aloof and somewhat standoffish in terms of emphasizing sort of change and capacity, while the idea to rebrand Mr. Kern as a chummy and the guy from next door, seemed to have sort of been a misguided strategy. In the end, the Social Democrats adopted a defensive blurring strategy because there was an issue environment that the Social Democrats felt it wasn't working for them, so they had a very strange way of dealing with that issue environment. And in the end, there was also the affair. I don't think it had a huge effect, it had any effect on the election outcome, but it was the affair that people associated with the Social Democrats were, there was the allegation that had set up websites in which they were supposedly or allegedly websites run by the conservatives in which Mr. Kurz was making anti-Semitic statements. But it turned out that these websites were actually organized by a group working with an Israeli campaign guru associated with people in the Social Democratic Party. And this became, if you ask some of my colleagues, the scandal of Austrian campaigning, the most important scandal in Austrian campaigning ever, and we can debate how significant that is, but this is a debate that is also going on in Austria and somehow ended up in the lap of Mr. Kern. Now, the Freedom Party is interesting. The populist Freedom Party was making a play for public office, and early on they wanted to signal respectability. This is a policy, or this is an approach the Freedom Party has been pursuing for some time now. We can date it sort of after 2011, 2012. They did this also for the European elections and to some extent in the presidential elections last year, but noticeably in this election. So initially their posters and their approach was focused on fairness and, we have to make Austria more efficient, and Austrians deserve better, a classic change theme. And their objective was clearly to enter government. And in fact, the Freedom Party was quite open whether to enter government with either the Social Democrats or the Conservatives. Currently, they're in a coalition with Conservatives and Social Democrats at the state level in Austria, and from a certain perspective, a coalition with the Social Democrats would have seemed very attractive to the Freedom Party because it would have given them a better chance of maintaining their profile. And nonetheless, the other interesting thing was that Strache, the leader of the Freedom Party, set the expectations rather low. I mean, given a party that was leading in the polls for a better part of 2 years, Strache's goal for the election was simply to say, well, we want to do better than the last election, which was a foregone conclusion because they were right around 20% in the previous elections, and it was quite clear they would do substantially better this time. Strache is, to some extent, there is a leadership issue going on in the Freedom Party as well. That's not very open, but it's quite clear there is another candidate, Mr. Hofer, who lost the presidential election by a slim margin last year, who has tremendous appeal, and he's certainly a candidate waiting in the wings. So Strache was under great pressure to either deliver an election victory or deliver the Freedom Party getting into government. The irony is that towards the second part of the summer, as the Conservative Party was moving further and further to the right and beginning to contest the issue ownership of who is tough on immigration, on asylum seekers, the Freedom Party was then becoming alarmed that somehow they would lose voters to Mr. Kurz. So the Freedom Party then changed direction, or at least began to re-emphasize their tried and trusted strategy against involving Islamophobia and xenophobia. And this second strategy, or the second part, was accompanied by a relentless campaign in the media, particularly in Vienna. There are these free subway rag sheets against immigrants. And let's give you an example here, with sort of schnitzels being outlawed in public schools because of Muslim students, or Afghan attacks a fellow student with a knife. Those kinds of the sort of daily drumbeat of the local tabloid media, in conjunction with an internet campaign, sort of really prepared the ground for this period. But I would argue that this was in part instigated by the Freedom Party, but in part it happened without the Freedom Party, and the Freedom Party took advantage of this. But it was certainly also something that the conservatives tapped into. So there we had, ironically, this contest between the conservatives and the Freedom Party as to for issue ownership of the immigration issue. You can see this. There was a very successful YouTube campaign by the Freedom Party, where Strache, the Freedom Party leader, presents himself as the forward thinker and the conservative as the latecomer. Also in this image here, you see the leader of the conservatives sort of copying the notes from Strache in school. This was sort of a Facebook campaign, and it was a YouTube video campaign. We can also demonstrate this in the social media. You can see when you look at the social media results here, number of social media interactions, that actually the Conservative Party was dominated actually the social media for quite a while, but particularly towards the end, the Freedom Party was resurgent, and it was particularly that late campaign that focused on particularly in Vienna, on the immigration issue. Overall, this was the first time, however, that the conservatives bested the Freedom Party overall in terms of social media use, in terms of followers, both on Twitter, in terms of followers also on Facebook. And you can see that the conservatives also had the more sophisticated by using a number of different social media. But when you look at the FPÖ here, the Freedom Party, you see that red slice, that's the YouTube campaign, that is the sort of forward thinker, latecomer campaign, which almost all my students, I'm not the right target demographic, but all my students got it when they looked in their Facebook page, or when they looked at certain, it popped up for them, and they were telling me anecdotally how crucial it was, and these are some early results from our media analysis. So to the election outcome, black in this case these are districts with a conservative majority. You can see the sea of black color surrounding these red islands, if you will, but then there's also the significant number of blue districts, and you notice particularly that southern Austria, the Freedom Party did extremely well in the southern province of Carinthia. This is Haider's old home state. Because of a Freedom Party related corruption scandal, they sort of they lost the previous elections, but seem to be making a comeback with a vengeance, and they're poised to do well in next year's state elections. But many of these blue districts that you can see, or many of the districts you see here in blue, used to be red. So that's where the Freedom Party sort of gained a lot of support in previously social democratic districts. The single biggest losers in the election, ironically, was the Green Party. I had a slide prepared, but I think we're going to have something on this later on, so I'm not going to say anything about it. I just point out that minus 8.6%, and the Green Party dropped out of parliament for the first time in decades. All the other parties ironically gained votes, even the Social Democrats, although the Social Democrats looked like losers, but they actually gained votes, and they attracted some green votes late in the campaign. 2/3 of the gains on the votes for the Conservatives and the Freedom Party were made in rural areas. You can see that in rural areas and smaller towns, the Freedom Party and the Conservatives were ahead of the Social Democrats. Only in the major urban centers, particularly Vienna, did the Social Democrats actually perform well. In Vienna, they performed actually better than had been expected. If we look at, just briefly, two tables, two slides from the voter transfer analysis, you can see very nicely that a lot of Green voters at the very top lend their votes to the Social Democrats. And of course, it wasn't helped that the Greens made a strategic mistake, in my view, by warning voters against a conservative Freedom Party government. And if you're a rational voter, you probably think that you're wasting your vote if you vote for the Greens. You're much better off lending your vote to the Social Democrats in ensuring that the Social Democrats would be stronger, would perform better. But the Greens in many ways paid the price for it. The Greens also paid the price because they had a rival Green Party, sort of a split off from the Green Party, that also siphoned off votes from the Greens. What is interesting here, I want to point out, this sort of where the Conservatives drew their votes from, pretty much from everywhere, including also from the Freedom Party, but particularly from two right-wing parties that had been defunct, but the voters were still on the political marketplace, and this party called Tim Stronach, and then a group called BZÖ, Alliance Future Austria, and those voters went in the majority to the Conservatives. But anyway, securing the Conservatives' win of. This is some data from our national election study. Your left, what you can see is when we look at items that would test for populism, sort of people who have sort of believe in sort of an antagonistic vision of society between the elite and the mass and the people. Clearly, Freedom Party voters were clearly responding to that. If we look at voters who look at different partisans and ask whether they would also vote for Mr. Kurz, you can see the affinity for those also voting for the Freedom Party. So we see there's a lot of exchange between these two parties. So it was much more with the Freedom Party than with any of the other parties. You also see here, for example, that the Greens, it was not always a lost cause for the Greens, that there was actually a significant number of voters, both Green Party voters, then other voters for a small Liberal Party, and Social Democratic voters were willing to vote for the Green Party. But in the end, the Green Party ended up being everybody's second choice, and therefore, when push came to shove, they ended up voting for their first preference, for their first choice. Also on the slide next to it is this split off from the Green Party, this list of Pilz, and Pilz had argued that he's offering his party as a choice for other. In competition, not with the Greens, but with voters who might otherwise vote for the Freedom Party. I think can see here very clearly that he primarily appealed to Green voters and to Social Democratic voters and to Liberal voters, but not to Freedom Party voters or Conservative voters. This slide shows you, again, confirms what we know from from similar cases in other countries, where people were asked how they would vote if there is a significant number of foreign residents in their district. And it is also borne out here that in those districts with very few, that are not very diverse, there's very few, the ratio of foreigners is very low, there's few refugees, few asylum seekers. These voters were primarily the voters who voted for the Freedom Party and the Conservative Party. Areas where the ratio of foreign residents is very high ended up voting for other parties. If we look at the results and the implications now, if you look at the distribution of seats, well, the major parties could essentially form, the three major parties could form governments with each other and would be constitutional, it would give them a majority. As was said, the likely outcome is a government by the Conservatives and the Freedom Party. The Conservatives have, in any event, a constitutional blocking majority. In Austria, you need 2/3 of the votes to pass a law that withstands a challenge at the Austrian Constitutional Court. This is a so-called constitutional law. You need a 2/3 vote in the parliament to amend the constitution. So if the Conservatives were not in government, they could certainly block constitutional majorities. And the small Liberal Party, NEOS, is valuable because it can provide any conservative-led coalition with the necessary votes to have a constitutional majority. So what do we expect domestically and internationally? Domestically, we would expect the conservatives to be liberal on economic policies and conservative on social policies. What I mean is, he's announced a deregulatory approach to the Austrian economy, cutting deficit without raising taxes, reduce taxes on corporations, on income and on labor. However, social benefits would become more dependent on contributions, on past performance, on status and nationality. For example, is seeking a universal minimum assistance pay and to shift payments to asylum seekers from a scheme of payments to in-kind benefits. He also wants a differential treatment of Austrians and EU citizens, particularly posted workers. Essentially, Kurz has suggested he would like to get the deal that Britain got before Brexit, and non-EU citizens would be able to qualify for social benefits only after having contributed for 5 years. We also can expect a reduced role for the social partnership in social and economic policy making and legislation. Now, one of the major possibly disturbing developments is that one of the main conditions the Freedom Party has stated for supporting or for going into a government with the Conservatives is the Freedom Party claims the Ministry of the Interior, that is policing in Austria. Both are trying to reduce the number of refugees and immigrants to zero. They're probably gonna pass a new immigration law that is based on what they call selectivity and need. That is, we can select the people, we want to select the people who come to us, and they will come if and when we need those individuals. There is going to be further, the Islam will be seen more from the perspective of posing a security threat, so that the securitization of policy towards Islam in Austria, including cultural policing. A burqa ban, a scarf ban went into effect a few weeks before the elections, but there's also the monitoring of imams, of Muslim teachers, and special values tests for teachers of religion, but it's applied pretty much only to teachers of Islam. Now, the last slide now deals with European and economic foreign policy, and since Mr. Kurz was rather vague in his pronouncements, let me give you an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario, because we don't really know where this is going to go. The optimistic scenario, a pro-European scenario, would be, first, we want to see some coordination with Visegrad countries and other Eurosceptic countries. There may be some distance to Germany and France, but fundamentally Austria will adhere to Austria's traditional role. The brewing conflict with Turkey or Saudi Arabia and other Islamic states will not escalate further beyond the current state. There'll be some tension. Austria will favor ending sanctions with Russia and push Austria's role as a mediator, but in concert with others. Austria is likely to be a hawkish Eurozone member, criticizing low interest rates, demanding strict adherence to austerity, will be a staunch critic of any idea of a European Union being a transfer union. But the idea is, in the optimistic scenario, it's going to be more bark than bite. It's much more for the domestic audience, but it will be less aggressive on the international level. Certainly, I would expect a push on EU policy on refugees, immigration, and Turkish accession. Austria is probably going to be most vocal there and try to influence the process to the extent it can. Also based on posted workers and on social transfer. The question is, what happens when Austria runs into trouble, say with the European courts or with the Commission, when Austria passes laws that somehow begin to treat EU citizens differently from Austrians? Does Austria acquiesce and say, well, we've tried but didn't get anywhere? Or does Austria escalate and use this then for domestic cohesion? And that's what remains to be seen. And that leads me to my last comment, the pessimistic scenario. We would see a close alignment of Visegrad countries and other Eurosceptics. we would see a significant distance to Germany and France. Continuing some of the criticism we've heard of Germany during the election campaign, Merkel was criticized by both Mr. Kurz and Mr. Strache on several occasions, framing this sort of Europe as the liberal elites or framing this as a big country versus small country discourse. These are two different ways in which this could be framed in the Austrian case. We could see the creation of an external boogeyman in the sense of Turkey, an Islamic country, posing a threat, particularly Saudi Arabia. There was some criticism of Saudi Arabia on and off over the last several years, and Saudi Arabia radicalizing Austrian imams. And also Brussels could play that role. On Russia, there could be a go-it-alone approach, or the Austrians could try to influence the internal German debate, particularly on the Eurozone, by aligning themselves with conservative critics of the ECB and aligning themselves with austerity hawks in the German debate, particularly in the CSU. And we might then see on these key issues that matter to Austrians, the refugee and immigration issue, the posted workers and the social transfers issue, we would see an escalation and a calculated major conflict with the EU in the interest of shoring up domestic support. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Reinhard, for this very concise but also dense and fact-rich overview. It made me realize how long the distance between Florence and Vienna or Salzburg is, because I had not been aware of many of these YouTube videos that seem to have been so important in the campaign. Anyway, I'll tell you briefly what the script for the rest of this event is. We've agreed on the sequence for the respondents and the other speakers, and we'll start with Laila, who will talk about the role that immigration and asylum has played as the dominant issue in the campaign. And then we'll move on to Sven, who will talk about the populist parties in a comparative perspective, also seeing how similar or dissimilar the Austrian populists are from the Swiss ones. Then we'll have Manes trying to explain the self-destruction of the Greens, but also then talking about the European impact that this outcome will have. And Bridget will take it up from there. And before I give the floor to Laila, I just want to say something I forgot in the beginning, which is to thank Bridget also for initiating this. She asked me, Rainer, are you willing to chair such a roundtable? And I said, yes, of course. And I think the turnout, I was initially skeptical, how many people would be interested in Austria. A bit more than a week ago, we had another roundtable on Catalonia that was quite packed. But as it seems, there is sufficient interest in the EUI in the politics, even of small member states that are not perceived to be, in total crisis and disarray. So that's a good sign, and I think we ought to keep it up. And I hope Bridget will take more such initiatives and keep asking also other people to host these events at the EUI. Laila, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks also for giving me the opportunity to talk here about the issue of migration. So Rainer approached me and said, can you say a few words which role migration played in these general election campaigns? And just to what you referred now, Austria indeed, it's a small country, but it's also a big player when it comes to migration politics inside the European Union. So we know that since the 1990s, alongside with Germany, really Austria shaped migration policy making also within the EU through its role in the Council. And also, and surprise, or not so much surprising, what was the role of migration in this general election campaign? As Reinhard Heinisch already mentioned, basically it was all about migration. So I just brought a little anecdotal evidence. So there was some debates on the private television on Puls 4, and at the end, the politicians, the main candidates, were asked to give each other a book, to the opposing party. And these were 3 of the books they exchanged with each other, which might be also interesting from an academic point of view, because most of us who do migration research will have come across this book, which one was by Paul Collier, Exodus, the other one by Alexander Betz and Paul Collier, Refuge, and the other one is by Green politician who It's about the integration of migrants in Germany, and he said we can't help all, so there has to be some limits on how many we can take. So I just wanted to ask, who do you think who gave the book by Paul Collier? Which party? Do you have a guess which party gave it to the other candidate? Any guess after what Reinhard Heinisch said also? If not, I solved the puzzle. So Paul Collier and the Green Book was given by Sebastian Kurz, our next Prime Minister, and Alexander Betz and Paul Collier was given by the Freedom Party, by Heinz Christian Strache, to the Green Party also. So it's really, but also by a side note, and since we're always concerned about academic research, which influence we have, I would say it's very much legitimizing approaches towards migration policies which are already decided upon, and it's by no chance that one of the most discussed, most critical books in migration research played a role also in this election campaign, the one by Paul Collier and Alexander Betz. But this would be another debate, but still I think it's interesting for us as scholars also to see which debates and which scholars have an impact. So since Rainer asked me to be brief, I made a little poster. So if the Austrian election campaign would be like a film, I would call it a film which has 3 heroes, no heroines, because the only heroine, they were kicked out of parliament, as we already heard, and they had a much more pro-migration approach, although was not on the top of the agenda. And I would call the movie, these 3 men are in Who Stopped the Flow. So this one, Strache, I made some subtitles. I said, I told you, you did not act. Then the one, the handsome man in the middle, Kurz, Sebastian Kurz, I stopped migration. And then the SPÖ, the Social Democrats, you just made an announcement, you just talked, I acted. So all of the 3, they claimed to have stopped the migration flows after the 2015 crisis, whereas we can see that the Conservative Party and the Freedom Party were much more proactive. The Social Democratic Party was really in a reactive position. Like, let's not talk about it too much. They really knew that they would lose because they don't have any issue ownership on the issue. And they had much more a pro-European, more on European cooperation pronunciation than did Kurz, who really very much said, we have to be the masterminds of Europe, we have to tell Europe what to do, whereas Strache pronounced that Europe actually is the problem in dealing with migrants and refugees. But basically, it was all about who did it, who stopped the flows, and who will do it in the future. And also really, so I counted the minutes of the television debates because I thought I really want to verify which space migration took, and I could really see that from debate it was 1/3 up to half of all the debates were about migration and immigrant integration. But also I want to say that really we have to put it in context. This is not an Austrian particularity. I just was in Brussels at the Joint Research Center on Migration, and there they told us that between January 2016 and July 2017, 30% of all council meetings discussed irregular migration. So again, Austria is by no way exceptionality. I think it really just reflects a wider trends. So the salience it's absolutely salient issue, but it's not only how much migration is debated, but also how it is debated and what is debated or what is not debated. So I just want to give you a short overview, which were the issues that the campaign focused on. And I mostly would like to focus on the Conservative Party, since they are the most important force nowadays. Again, I want to stress that Austria is really not an exception. Some of you might have seen the New York Times headlines, which said in election, Austria's Nazi past raises its head. I think that's really a misinterpretation what happens in Austria, because I would say also from my research on Europe as a region as a whole, in the MICPLOS research I'm doing here at the UI, is like Austria is really paradigmatic in many, many ways for wider regional trends in Europe, how migration is understood and reacted to. So I think we really have to change and shift this discourse from Austria as the exceptional case because of its Nazis past. So And I think it's really a showcase also the issues which are very much mirrored on a wider regional level. So one of the major issues was the issue of irregular migration, which basically was about border control and the extraterritorialization of border control. So prevent migration already origin and transit countries. So this was very much the focus. But also when you look at the discourse of the Conservative Party, he said, I did it. I closed the Balkan route. So he was, again, the one, because of his foreign relations, he claimed with the Balkan states that he managed to close the Balkan route. No mention of the Turkey-EU deal, which already stopped migrants at this stage of the route. Also, he claimed Italy was all the time in the debates. So Italy was the main reference because he said he put pressure on Italy. That's now the deal different. That's why they deal differently now with NGOs in the Mediterranean who rescued migrants. So it was the success of Kurz in his own perception and how he presented himself. And also he changed the whole mindset in the European Union. Again, this was his claim, that also the European Union understood that we have to be much more restrictive. And I think in this regard, he will have like a wider impact also on the European Union, because he's not the one, I would say, who would be more cooperative. He really pushes for domestic politics at the European Union level. So also his proposed solutions are really, seal off the Mediterranean Sea route. So he wants to completely seal off the Mediterranean Sea. Let's not debate how realistic this is. Of course, the old fight smugglers solutions. If you come with a smuggler, Kurz wants you to lose your right to claim asylum in Europe. Detention centers in transit countries. And the less for less principle means you give development aid to countries of origin, but if then they don't cooperate in terms of migration, of taking back migrants or preventing them from coming, they will get also less. External rescue centers, so people who are rescued in the Mediterranean, like the Strache, the FPÖ always told of Frontex as being a smuggler in itself, because migrants who are rescued abroad to Europe. This Kurz wants to change by having rescue centers outside of Europe. Also so-called protection centers. People who made it to Europe but need protection should be brought to these protection centers outside of Europe, or otherwise should be returned to origin countries. Also then resettlement, but to a restricted number. So it's really, I think in the interpretation and framing is really that if we are too liberal, if we signal that we open, that we take refugees and migrants, that's part of the problem. So what we have to do is signal like, do not come, we will not take you. And also hand in hand comes like issues like rescuing of migrants in the Mediterranean is very much interpreted as a pull factor. Like the whole debate we had about Mare Nostrum in Italy, also reserved now, it was very clear that by the Conservative Party this is seen as a pull factor which should be avoided. And also, of course, very famously was part of the electoral program of the Conservative Party, Australia as a role model. And also those of us who do migration research, we know that Australia is the most hardline, has one of the most hardline policies when it comes to refugees. That's the role model of the Conservative Party. I just also had some of the Social Democratic Party. I will not go into it, but basically the program of the Social Democratic Party about migration is basically the commission line. Very much, again, like preventing migration, because refugees are primarily seen as economic migrants. We can go more into the debate into it. Just very briefly to mention, of course, Reinhard Heinisch already mentioned, like Islam was one of the big issues. Again, the answer by the Conservative Party, zero tolerance. So radicalization, political Islam, very much an aspect of control, controlling Islamic associations and mosques, and closing radical Islamic kindergartens, so to say, and really to have more resources in order to control deviant players. Very much, of course, which is a continuity, is like a use of gender nationalism to attribute violence and against women to Muslim communities. So it's very much a continuation also of the wider debate in Europe. And also the logic, the underlying logic is that control of migration is a precondition for immigrant integration. So because too many migrants would prevent integration. And Kurz always stressed during the elections that he doesn't want to put Muslims under general suspicion. So he wants to put control without putting Muslims under general suspicion, but this is exactly what happened, I would say. Then, of course, the issue of welfare, again, the wider European debate mirrored here. The welfare state seen as a pull factor. Also, Rainer has worked a lot on these debates. But this is really in the mindset of the European politicians, of which Austria is a paradigmatic example. And also here, again, we have the British debates. It's also about the EU migrants, where also, as Reinhard Heinisch already mentioned, access to social benefits should be only provided after 5 years. To be more exact, the basic minimum income scheme. And also for refugees, he wants to curtail it to 560 euros in the first 5 years. Yes, 560 euros would also imply many NGOs warned that this will lead to mass homelessness, also of refugees. But again, it resonates very much with the electorate. 69% of Austrians believe that migration is a burden for the welfare state. It's a Chatham House study this summer. Yeah, so these were really, to say, these three big issues. So issue linkage with welfare, immigrant integration, Islam, and irregular migration. And also, I'm already, sorry. Very briefly, it was also one of the main deciding factors, the migration issue, mainly, but we already discussed about this. So if I need to summarize the general election campaigns and the role of migration, I would say the man who claims to have closed the Balkan route becomes Austrian next prime minister. And to close off, it's like really, the election result, I would say, is bad news for a potential shift of perspectives on migration. We see a repeated migration hysteria all over Europe, and the lens of irregularity and consequent perspective of migrants as a security problem is really here to stay at the top of the agenda. I just returned from Brussels last week, and here also in the Commission, everybody told me we're very aware the Austria will hold the Council presidency, and we will have even more, put more emphasis on migration. And really, but I would say this perspective, we really have to emphasize that it's ignoring the fact that the majority of migrants who are in the European Union are entered legally and live legally in Europe. And also that the problem is also one of conflating labor migration with irregularity and disconnecting economic migration from the idea of legal migration.
Thank you very much, Laila. So we move on to Sven. And sorry for for looking at the watch several times, but we want to leave certainly half an hour at least for the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for giving me also the floor here. I have to say I feel a bit embarrassed being surrounded by so many specialists on Austrian politics. So I thought my role is probably rather a bit looking back in history and taking a bit this kind of bird's eye view of a comparative political scientist. And more precisely, what I do is comparing Austria and the developments there with the Swiss experience. And that I do not just because I'm Swiss and I've been growing up 5 minutes away from the Austrian border, but I really think that Austria, if you look at it, kind of the development since the 1990s, is in some way catching up with the developments in Switzerland. And most likely, if we look at what the parties also propose in terms of institutional changes, and I will come to that later on, it will probably even resemble the Swiss kind of democratic model further in the future. So let me quickly say, as already Kitchell has said, the two kind of countries and the populist radical right parties there are really kind of paradigmatic cases or limiting cases because they just belong to the most successful ones. Here you see the share of the whole party family, so not kind of taking into account split-offs, for example, of the BZÖ and the FPÖ, but you just see here kind of the Swiss and the Austrian line are very close apart from the short period when the FPÖ kind of had a bad experience being in the national government. And you see also here the trend lines for the northwest of Europe and of course the south much lower there. They're just really leading the pack in terms of the success. And what I want to now say is kind of three short kind of messages that we can discuss in how I think they kind of converge over time. And the first one is really that there is this kind of toxic mix of what we've just heard, this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment with growing Euroscepticism. And I think that the European question is also on top of the agenda. There, Switzerland was far ahead, where the populist right really started with kind of the European question, then moved over to immigration, whereas it feels like the other way around in Austria. The second kind of message I want to give you is that over time, because these parties have become so successful and now it feels like the conservatives in Austria are just copying the role model of the populist right, we also see this whole transformation of the political space in Northwestern Europe coming a bit like full circle. So I think it's no longer that they kind of break up a new dimension that is cross-cutting kind of the normal left-right divide as we used to see it before, but now we really see a new type of one-dimensionality, and they've really kind of changed politics as we used to know it in these two countries. And the final kind of message I want to underline with a few of these line graphs is then what happens next when they're in government. Here we still have this positive message, actually they mess it up themselves. But I think looking at what is ahead of us, I think they've learned a lot from that experience. So let me first just bring in here some data we had on the mass media and the campaign as it is reflected there. Of course, unfortunately, I don't do instant research, so I don't have the last election in here. But I think what you see here is the overall polarization on a range of issues, from economic to non-economic issues. And we have one reference campaign in the 70s, and then you see all of them from the 1990s forward. And I think what I just want to highlight is, of course, the days of kind of consociationalism and low levels of polarization are gone. But what you also see here is that Switzerland, in terms of having really strong opposing campaigns, camps, highlighting the different messages, was always much more polarized in terms of the campaigns than the Austrian experience. And to tell you why this is, in the next graph you will just see this for immigration and European integration. And because the graph has a super strong zigzag, just look at what is above these kind of red lines that you already see there. And here you really see Austria, kind of the development from the 1990s up to the last election in 2013. And what I just want to stress here, immigration was already a very polarized topic all through these kind of years. Of course, kind of having lower and higher values depending how strong the different camps were in the campaign. You would get the highest value of one if you really had 50-50 of the very strong supportive camp versus a very strong anti-camp. But over time, you also see that after kind of accession to the EU, the discourse in Austrian politics has become the more and more Eurosceptic and the more and more openly kind of polarizing conflicts. Also, looking at other data we have kind of on integration debates related to the major integration steps we have seen in this period, Austria was always one of the countries where you really got kind of a public debate, be it on deepening of the European integration, but also its widening in terms of Eastern enlargement and then Turkish accession. And just to compare that kind of to the Swiss picture, there, this kind of strong tendencies to have highly polarized conflicts over European integration, as we all know, they were there before, and that's why also the Swiss kind of campaigns were already more polarized before. If you would now add kind of salience to this picture in terms of how much do we really see these different positions, the picture would even get kind of stronger in terms of that Austria, at least in election campaigns, had for a long time not seen really proper kind of visible fights over European integration, but that has slowly started to change. Now, what does that tell us kind of in terms of the dimensionality? People still think about these issues of European integration and immigration as kind of cross-cutting the major lines of conflict in party competition. So they're still kind of deviant from the general picture, and we kind of then talk about wedge issues or issue entrepreneurs that really seize the moment to kind of break into the system. But I think in these two countries, for sure, you can no longer talk about wedge issues or issue entrepreneurs. These kind of issues are there. We have highly polarized conflicts. Everyone is talking about them. And what happens there, I think, is rather that over time, they've become so closely embedded in the main line of conflict that they are the main line of conflict. And also in Switzerland, given that the populist radical right has become the strongest party and the one that is most favorable also in terms of economic liberalism, kind of even pushing the liberal parties on that front, they really kind of lead to a new kind of one-dimensionality of politics in these two countries. And this I try to highlight in this kind of a bit complicated graphs, which show you kind of it's highly condensed, all the issue positions you have, all the types of salience these parties attribute. But what is just important here, that on the left side, you see kind of the left camp of the Social Democrats and the Green parties that are by now kind of on this more pro-welfare, and then also on the kind of opposite side of the immigration divide. And by no means you see in here a very kind of pronounced orthogonal picture of kind of a still dominant left-right conflict that is kind of cross-cut by a second line of conflict. And I think if you would now kind of do this for the 2017 campaign, my hunch at least would be that you see even a stronger integration of the two dimensions, although maybe the SPÖ has a bit moved closer to the anti-immigration camp. But this, I think, is the new reality, or that's, I try to be here a bit bold, at least my claim of politics in these two countries, that we should no longer think about these issues as cross-cutting in any way. And then my final claim, having said that we have these polarized conflicts, we have them having gone full circle in reshaping politics in these two countries, the question is, what happens next? What happens when they are in power? And I think also here it's interesting to compare a bit the Swiss and the Austrian experience, and I hope we can discuss that a bit more. What I bring you here, as also being a social movement scholar, is protest participation in Austria from the mid-1970s up to 2011. And the Austrians are a quiet people, if you would ask me, in terms of their protest participation. And the only major really peak that you see here that was a bit sustained over time was when the Freedom Party in the early 2000s joined the national government. And I'm pretty sure we will not find this strong reaction of civil society evermore, given the mainstreaming of these ideas, given a very weak opposition from the left. And I think what is even more resembling the Swiss experience, where we've never seen this strong kind of opposition in the streets to the populist right in government, is that most of the parties, and especially the Freedom Party, they have really learned their lesson. They're now pushing very much for direct democracy, and I would not be surprised that they will implement some kind of direct democratic kind of procedures that have some legally binding force, even though with a high threshold, but they will be so strong, the Conservatives and the Freedom Party, that they can easily kind of mobilize a few 100,000 Austrians to sign some kind of initiative or call for a referendum. And I think that really then goes into the Swiss direction, that this being in government, even in a coalition government, will no longer be the disenchantment of the populist radical right, but they can easily play the role of being the main opposition party while being in government. And I think this will probably also be for Europe one of the kind of more worrying signals, if it's not just about immigration or anti-immigration and getting different approaches that are anyways already on the run, but it's rather when they really change the institutional setting of how domestic politics might be kind of entangled into this multi-level system, as Bridget calls it, the multi-level politics of Europe. I think this is now really leading kind of the front there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sven. Manes, do you want to come over here? Yeah, sure.
So I'm old school, I go without PowerPoint. I'd like to make 3 claims on the election in my contribution. First, a claim on the Greens. Second, a claim on government formation and the role of the Austrian presidency. And third, on Austria and the European Union. So my first claim is that, among others, the defeat of the Austrian Greens reflects a growing debate on the left in Europe on how to approach the issue of immigration. Let me first remind you of how successful the Austrian Greens have been. Not only did they clinch the presidency, or one of their former leaders did last year, but also if we look at the average parliamentary share in Western Europe, and if we exclude the Icelandic left Green Party, which is rather a radical left party, the Austrian Greens have been the most successful Green Party in Western Europe. And now they are voted out of parliament. Already since last year, the party was relatively crisis-prone. In 2016, they did not have a strong public profile because the party kept largely silent in order not to risk the electorability of former leader van der Bellen during the presidential campaign. Later, the party got into conflict with its own youth base. Some of the youth activists went to the communists. The party's long-term leader resigned only a few months before the unexpected snap elections of this October. And one of their key figures, Peter Pilz, who was already mentioned, in fact, the politician that brought the now Austrian president to the Green Party in the 1990s, he became a renegade after not getting the place on the Green Party list that he desired at the last party congress. Peter Pilz was in conflict with the Green Party leadership since quite a while. He wanted them to follow an agenda that he self-describes as left-wing populism, where he combines a left-wing stance on social and economic matters with a more regulatory stance on matters of immigration, which became one of his key themes during the election. Already at the peak of the so-called refugee crisis, he claimed that he doesn't celebrate when refugees come to Austria. And in the past months, he focused on what he calls the political Islam as what he calls threat, similarly strong as the radical right to Austrian values. And he focused on the regulation of immigration. For example, asylum requests and proceedings should happen outside of Europe. And as Laila already said, that strong focus on immigration is by no way unique to Austria. And this is also the case with this internal split, perhaps, when it comes to the Austrian left. If you think about Germany, you showed the book by Boris Palmer, the mayor of Tübingen, who is a Green politician associated with very restrictive positions to immigration and integration. If you think about the German Left Party, 2 days after the German election, the former Left Party leader Oskar Lafontaine triggered again an internal debate within the Left Party how liberal or how regulatory the party should be when it comes to immigration. So while this is not the only reason why the Greens split and why the Greens failed to enter parliament, among others, their defeat reflects that growing discussion within the Western European left on how to approach immigration, in my view. That's my first statement. My second relates to the government formation process in Austria. As was already mentioned, most likely Kurz will govern together with the radical right Freedom Party. And my statement is that this government formation process shows how weak the Austrian presidency is. Remember, last year a former leader of the Green Party was elected Austrian president, and he certainly does not have strong sympathies or any sympathies for radical rightists in government. But it does not seem like he can prevent this. Although constitutionally, the Austrian political system is semi-presidential. Duverger once ranked it among the political systems in Europe with the strongest presidents. If we think about France, the French president is not able to dismiss the prime minister, for example. The Austrian president is indeed able to do so constitutionally. But the reality since 1945 has been a very weak Austrian presidency related to different factors. Austrian presidents mainly have been social democrats, for example, and social democrats never wanted to have the office of a president in the Austrian political system in the first place. So presidents remained symbolic figures that hardly influenced government formation processes, with some exceptions. In 2000, a courageous conservative president, Thomas Klestil, tried to prevent the radical right Freedom Party to being included in government, but he could not ultimately prevent this government formation. He could only prevent the appointment of two doubtful figures as FPÖ ministers. And this also seems to be the limit of van der Bellen. The former Green leader said in September 2015 whether or not he would appoint an FPÖ government. He responded with the sentence, "I would not do it." That was before the campaign. At the beginning of the campaign in 2016, he said it's hard for him to imagine appointing a government which includes the FPÖ. And in October 2016, just before the end of the campaign, he said, well, if I don't have a choice, I would do it. And although he does not need, constitutionally, legally, to appoint a government he does not want, it seems like he will, similar to all other presidents since 1945, respect the parliamentary majority and appoint a government with the Freedom Party, which of course leads to the question, what is the value of the office when a Green president cannot prevent the inclusion of a Freedom Party in government? What he might do, however, is to prevent certain ministers. My third statement is on Austria's relationship with the European Union. Reinhard said it's difficult to predict, of course, what will happen. My expectation is that one should not overstate the differences of the new government with the political mainstream in Western Europe. For example, when it comes to the Eurozone, the Austrian government is expected to follow the positions of the new German government. So against any transfer union, against Eurobonds, for example, but they are not even proposed by Macron at the moment. When it comes to Turkey, the new Austrian government will be against Turkish European Union membership, but this has been the party line of the conservatives in Germany since forever. When it comes to immigration, I also don't think that Austria will depart too much from the Western European mainstream, as Laila has said. If you think about the so-called closure of the Balkan route that Kurz claims credit for, by now we know that while some figures of the German government publicly denounced this move, they did not try to stop this closure. So I think that the divisions there are not that great. Where I can see a conflict with the European Union is how to handle immigration not from outside the European Union, but from inside the European Union. As Laila and I think Reinhard already stated, Kurz demands a limitation of social transfers to European Union immigrants. They should only receive this after 5 years of being in Austria. The demand is, as far as I know, very vague because he does not state what social transfers he is referring to. He also does not state which European Union immigrants he is referring to. But if he makes such a move, I can see here an incompatibility with European Union law and one of the basic principles of the European Union. So these are my 3 statements. The defeat of the Green is partially related to the matter of immigration and how to approach the issue as a left-wing party. The second claim was the president will hardly play a role in government formation. And the third point was that I don't think that there will be huge conflicts with the European Union in the next years. Thanks.
Thank you, Manes. Now, last but not least, Bridget's reflections from the outside and the European perspective.
Well, since I'm neither a psephologist nor a specialist on Austria, I want to think a little about what all of this means for the European Union. And what do I mean, all of this? I mean the rise of the radical right in Europe and its implications for the EU. And there's no doubt that we can, with considerable evidence now, say that the radical right is stronger in Europe today than it's ever been before, that there is a blurring between the conservative right and the radical right, and that the political price has tended to have been paid by the left, and particularly by social democracy. And any major shift in domestic politics and government formation in the member states inevitably has implications for the European Union, both for policy balances, for who's at the table, and for what happens in future. So I would say 4 things that we need to pay attention to. Firstly, radical right parties are all deeply Eurosceptic. There are no radical right parties that support the project of European integration. Some of them, I would say, are at the Europhobic end. In other words, the collapse of the system would be something they would welcome. Now, interestingly, after Brexit, there was, in the at least popular or media discourse, an argument that this would lead to a domino effect with Nexus, Frexit, everyone was going to exit. Interestingly, in the elections, particularly the Dutch and French elections, anti-European stances have not actually won votes for parties. For example, the Front National lost votes because of its position on the euro. In other words, although the French may not like the present institutional architecture and policy architecture of the euro, the French electorate does not want to leave. So I think it really does matter in thinking about the next Austrian government, how the balance will play out on Europe between the Conservatives and the Freedom Party. And that, in my view, is unclear. Which direction will Kurz go on Europe? But I think what we can certainly say, and I think that this has already been reflected in what has been said already today, is that the rise of the radical right have already had and will continue to have a very significant impact on agenda setting in the EU, and particularly in relation to mobility and migration. On mobility, for example, the question of intra-EU mobility is back on the table. I think what we will see is much more agreement on areas like the Posted Workers Directive and absolute intolerance for treating EU citizens differently to domestic citizens. That simply won't fly, and there will be infringement proceedings and requirement of compliance. But I do think that there were many countries in the EU that were quite happy with the Cameron deal. In other words, the importers of labour. And so I think that you will see development there. On migration, asylum, refugee, I think Europe will become a more hostile and colder place. There will be a lot of pressure on the borders, and it won't be opening borders, it will be closing and policing borders. And the issue of burden sharing in terms of refugees and asylum seekers is not going to disappear. But certainly on agenda setting, there already is evidence of impact, but this will continue and, in my view, be accentuated. Thirdly, what to do about the authoritarians at the table. The European Union now has, in Hungary and Poland, two governments that are effectively in breach of the core Article 2 values of the European Treaty in terms of the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, etc., and the institutional fabric of their justice systems. The EU has found and really struggled to deal with this. It can deal with a non-member state who wants to become a member state. It can simply say no accession and have a tremendous impact. But once countries join and have a seat at the table, the Article 7, which paradoxically are a result of the original Austrian government, the sanctions, if you remember, in 2000 against Austria. So again, where will Austria lie on this issue? Will it become a supporter of the Visegrad? And remember, after the election in the Czech Republic this weekend, we don't quite know how that government will sit on a lot of this. Will it become a protector of the illiberal governments to the east? And here I think there are extremely strong functional and normative arguments for the EU. Functionally, European cooperation requires trust, legal certainty, and judicial systems that work. Without it, without being able to uphold contracts and trust the legal systems of the member states, this is deeply problematic for the EU, as is open defiance of the European Court of Justice. So in other words, will it acquiesce or will it fight the ECJ? And then, of course, and I don't need to make the normative argument about the importance of European values. So then finally, on the future of the EU, we have on the one hand Macron, his Sorbonne speech, his strong Europhile, at least so far, argument about the need to stand up for the EU and the need to deepen integration. Looking across the member states of the EU today, there are three sets of governments. There isn't just elite electorate divisions in Europe. There are really deep elite divisions now on the future of the European Union. And I would say the three-way split is between those who want more Europe broadly, those who want the status quo, and those who want a return of powers to the member states. And they're quite distinct. Now, when you have preferences that are that divergent, one might conclude automatically, well, no move on the policy front in the EU. And here I'm not so sure, because I think that there are at least 2 to 3 areas that one will see move. And here I'm not talking about immigration. I think on security and defense, the Trump effect, the Putin effect on security and defense is not just of interest to the western half of the continent or the southern half of the continent. It is a crucial area for the eastern half of the continent. So I think regardless of the preferences, you might get some movement there, and there already is in terms of the shared defence fund. Secondly, and here this will depend on what happens, the Jamaica coalition and what kind of programme of government it has, Eurozone. So the Austrian government is not going to be confronted with having to decide bonds, but it will have to discuss the completion of banking union and some stability buffer mechanisms in the Eurozone. But it'll be much less than if it was a grand coalition in Germany. It's never going to be quite at the upper end of what Macron is looking for. And then finally, there will be a lot of discussion and debate about variable geometry, differentiation, and as always, when you have a divergence of preferences, then those who want to move always argue for smaller core groups going ahead as almost a way of, in a sense, the others having to decide where they lie on a lot of this. So I would say for Austria, yes, there are some critical issues ahead, but I don't think it's a dramatic shift in the Austrian position in the EU, albeit one never knows, because the other thing that I think all of us will have to conclude about politics in Europe today is that they're more volatile than we have ever seen them for quite a while.
Thanks to Bridget and all the speakers. That leaves us about 15 minutes, I would guess, as a minimum for questions from the audience. And then I'll give it back to the speakers for short replies. So can you please, when you have a question, first identify yourself. Secondly, say to whom your question is addressed. And thirdly, keep it as short as you can. Adrienne.
Adrienne Héritier, Professor Emeritus in SPS. I have two questions actually to the Austrians, but okay, and one to Sven. To the Austrians, as regards what was also kind of talked about by Bridget, the possible alliance with Visegrad states on migration issues in particular. But what about all the dividing issues, as Austria being a net payer, Austria in regional politics being on the kind of not receiving end, so lots of divergences between the Visegrad countries and Austria. And the second question to Sven, I thought it was really intriguing to hear what you said about direct democracy instruments and the kind of siphoning these feelings of anti-migration. So would you say that the instruments of direct democracy are an instruments which are dangerous in kind of giving voice to these populist feelings altogether, and that they will be moving to Austria as well and the European Union more in the future?
We'll keep collecting if there are more questions. And if there, well, yes.
Marco Morini, Jean Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. My question go for to Manes, probably. Green Party is probably the big loser of these elections, minus 8 points, if I remember correctly, out of parliament. How about green issues in general? There was space for them in the agenda of the three major parties, or they will also be out of parliament? Thank you.
Questions right now, then that gives Sven and Manes and also the others a chance to answer these precise questions, and then we'll have a second round.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adrien. I think it's really a very good question, but I'm not so struck that it will kind of arouse even more of this anti-immigration or Eurosceptic sentiments, but just thinking that you become now an institutional engineer that kind of implants direct democracy in the current setting. I would say they have even more in mind this, how do we kind of then bring it up to the European level, no? How can we kind of design these tools that they're very much still a tool of the government and the tool of the opposition to kind of have it as a bargaining tool on the upper level, which for Switzerland probably because it's historically there, then they never kind of entered. But what happens now if they kind of try to change the system while it's kind of up and running? And I think it will just feed into this populist sentiment that, listen, see, they don't do what we kind of brought you on the table and you decided, for example, to not go further in certain areas, and kind of the Austrian people were then overruled by broader majorities. So I think that is a bit my fear, not that the instrument per se changes public opinion, but that the government will very strategically design the tools.
Allow me to quickly add first something on direct democracy, which I read in the morning in the newspaper, actually. An interview with Norbert Hofer, last year's Freedom Party presidential candidate, and one of those who will negotiate with the Conservative Party on a possible coalition agreement. And he proposed a mechanism that calls for a Supreme Court revision of the proposed question before it is put on the ballot. So this would be a difference to the Swiss political system that might be relevant for the way the Austrian political system embedded in the European Union will deal with direct democracy in the next few years. And on the green issues and whether they are out of the public debate in Austria or not, with the Greens leaving the national parliament, 3 points perhaps. First, the Greens are still well embedded on the sub-national level. They are in some regional governments where they could focus on environmental issues if they want so. So they have still the chance to set the agenda on this matter, to some extent at least. Second, Bild, the renegade Green politician who is in parliament, mentioned that he certainly will focus on environmental issues. To what extent this will be the case remains to be seen, of course. And third, the issue of environmentalism was already largely absent in this campaign, also when it comes to the Greens, and it was actually a substantial difference to the German political discussion, which focused so much on the registration of diesel engines and whether they should be banned from 2030 onwards or not. This also led to some interesting intra-party division within the German Greens, because Kretschmann, the Green regional governor of Baden-Württemberg, heads a region which has Stuttgart as its capital, so car manufacturer center of Germany. This debate was more or less absent in the campaign in Austria, although it took place at more or less the same time as in Germany. So I think green issues will matter, or the environment as a green issue will matter even less now than it had in the past campaign.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Thank you for your comment on the Visegrad countries. Clearly, there are also differences that Austria has with them. The very idea of differential welfare payments to posted workers or social security transfers to workers mostly from neighboring Hungary and Slovakia and Romania are certainly dividing issues. The question will be to what extent the salience of the immigration issue will come to dominate, to what extent they will be able to compartmentalize those issues, and it will certainly depend on what benefits the various leaders domestically, where they are in their own election cycle, and whether, mutual help is more preferential than anything else. So that's why it was one scenario, but I don't, there's plenty that divides them. That's quite clear. But we also know that populist parties are very often very capable of mobilizing quickly and then shifting. So I mean, this may not be in the end. What matters to them is how it plays domestically at a given time. I was very much struck by what Bridget said, and I think particularly those of us or those of you who are interested in migration research see that, of course, this is an alarming issue. But we need to remind ourselves that the issue of immigration, of course, is a legitimate topic, and lots have changed. So this is a big salient issue for the Austrian electorate. The main problem that we have is that we don't debate this issue, and a more or less conservative approach is maybe legitimate, but the issue is that we're not debating this at the European level, because all the parties that are pushing is essentially, as we said, anti-European, Eurosceptic parties. So that is the dividing issue on immigration is at the same time an issue where on one side we have essentially anti-European parties and then pro-European parties. So this is not debated at the European level, but it's a divide between Europe and the member states. So the stronger these parties get, the weaker the idea of integration, of the common European approach gets, and that's sort of the fundamental challenge. And the Austrian conservatives have so far presented themselves as a fundamentally and strongly pro-European party. This was also the reason behind the conflict in the first coalition between the Conservatives and the Freedom Party in 2000, that in many ways the natural instincts of the Conservatives is always to revert to a pro-European course. With Mr. Kurz, we're not sure whether that's the case. Because even on the economic front, you could make an argument that the Conservatives sort of seem to be saying that, you know, the European bureaucracy is stifling to some extent also the European economy, and so it extends into other areas. This sort of Euroscepticism extends into other areas as well. Just one word on the Green Party. I think there were a number of other factors as well. The Green Party was sort of extremely resistant to modern campaigning. They certainly had a candidate that was not particularly charismatic, and the party left her alone in the campaign. And the issues and the framing of the issues had all sorts of problems. I mean, we could debate that. So I think there were mistakes made by the Green Party as well. But overall, the Greens essentially failed in Austria to develop a core stock of voters that will vote for the Greens no matter what. They're sort of everybody's second favorite choice. I mean, if Austria had German ballot, if you had a first and a second vote, the Greens would have clearly made it. But the fact that if there's a crucial election and then each and every voter finds a way of going somewhere else, then a party has a structural problem, because these elections might be coming along all the time. So I think the Greens really need to think about how to present the issues in a different way, and how to present the issues in a way that are less abstract, they matter more. When the Greens were framing campaigns in terms of voting for TTIP or for some current campaign, sort of made it matter, they performed much better. But if you talk in a more abstract way about, sustainability and global and environmental and global warming, it just doesn't resonate when you have three other parties running on sort of the house is on fire, we've got to do something now.
Thanks. So if nobody else wants to ask a question, it's probably my duty as a chair to do so. So I have one question for Sven and one probably for Manes, Laila and Reinhard, whoever wants to pick it up. Sven, I found this extremely interesting, the idea that Austria might in some ways be trying to catch up with Switzerland also on the direct democracy issue that has been very strongly promoted by the Freedom Party. Basically, the Freedom Party proposed this. Austria already has direct democracy instruments. What the Freedom Party proposes is that popular initiatives that carry a certain number of signatures will lead to mandatory referendums that are then binding, which is not the case so far. So my question is whether it might also be in some ways the other way around, that Switzerland becomes more like Austria. And that's especially because, as far as I see it, Swiss direct democracy was conceived of and works well as a counterbalance to consociationalism and to the kind of strange government formula that always secured the same parties with a certain proportion of seats in government. Now, consociationism was also very strong in Austria after World War II, but it has broken down much earlier. And you've got a much more competitive party system now, and the danger of introducing direct democracy in the Austrian context is it's no longer counterbalancing, it's reinforcing, populism. That is the danger. And that might be happening in Switzerland too. But consociationalism and a much deeper form of federalism might still be there as counterweights in the way that they never really are there in the Austrian scene. So that's the question to you. And the other question I have to the other speakers is a little bit focused on the Green Party. What I find puzzling is that if you're a small party that has a maximum of 12% of the electorate, and you find that all the other parties drop the issues of European Union in the sense of pro-EU, and of migration and refugee in the sense of a humanitarian approach that the Greens have stood for in the past. And that had a quite strong resonance in Austrian civil society in 2015 and before. Why wouldn't it have been a good electoral strategy to say, we are the only party campaigning on these issues? We occupy the space. Of course, we won't win the elections, but that was ruled out anyhow, right? Why focus instead on climate change that was ignored by everybody else and didn't give the Greens a specific profile? So I'm just wondering whether that might have been the key mistake in the Green election campaign. Because, you know, if you don't stand up for the issues that are the most controversial ones and take the other side, then how are you going to mobilize your vote, right? If it's everybody else, including the renegade party, is, you know, drifting towards the mainstream right on these issues, you know, what space is left for you if you don't take it up? That's not the case, then we'll just have a kind of no? Philip? Yeah.
I would just be interested, sorry, my name is Johannes, I'm an SPS researcher. I would just be interested in terms of electoral support, whether there are any characteristics of age groups, especially because Kurz is such a young candidate. Was he especially supported by the youth or through all age groups? And also in general, in terms of the three big parties in the electoral system, are there any factors that are interesting?
You know, this shows a real pro always has a slide that he hasn't shown yet. Jelena, sure.
Because I was at the presentation by Elizabeth Hook and Gary Marks, who also spoke about these differences in education levels. So you mentioned the urban-rural divide. So is there also education level differences in Austria? Thank you.
Schuman said that.
Sorry, thank you. If you look at the slide to your left, you see age and voting preferences. And you can see that Mr. Kurz, the Conservative, did well across all age ranges. So young people, middle-aged, and older ones. You see the Freedom Party, the very young and the very old are less likely to vote for the Freedom Party. It's a typical mid-range, middle-age party. You see the Green Party was much more supported this time by young but less by old, and also interestingly the Social Democrats this time. Usually the Social Democrats are heavily favored by pensioners, but we have a different result this time. So it seems to be a Mr. Cairn effect. So again, further indication that a lot of people who otherwise vote for the Greens or are very liberal-minded went for Mr. Cairn. In terms of the outcome, in terms of educational strata, again, we've had university education and people with advanced secondary schooling voted for the Neos and also the Social Democrats this time more heavily, while the Freedom Party came in first among blue-collar workers. And Mr. Kurz did well across all educational ranges, but more so among the more educated, less so among the less educated, but much better than previously. Previously, the Conservatives did particularly well with the bourgeois middle-class clientele, but this time it was sort of more even, but nonetheless clearly in favor of those with slightly better education. The Freedom Party, again, the least educated, most likely to vote for the Freedom Party in some ways. What is interesting this time, there was a significant voting difference between based on gender for the Freedom Party, that women were significantly less likely to vote for the Freedom Party in the past. This has somewhat changed this time. So women actually voted more heavily for the Freedom Party than in previous elections. Still a gender difference, but the gender difference became smaller than in the past.
Okay, thanks. I think it's time to come to concluding statements, and maybe we'll do it just in reverse order. Bridget.
Well, can I just, the issue or question around direct democracy, I think the member states have had between 50 and 60 referendums on EU issues. of which maybe 9 or 10 have been negative referendums. Of course, the idea of a national referendum is problematic for the EU insofar as the outcome has implications for other member states and systemic implications, but the voters of those countries have no voice. So it's concentrated voice in one country with implications for everyone else. But to change that would be a profound constitutional change in the EU and one that's not available, insofar as if you had European-wide referendums, you then would overcome the requirement constitutionally to have the consent of all member states. And there's nothing that I see in the EU at the moment that would suggest that the EU will breach the dominance of domestic constitutions in that matter. So I think the EU has to cope with or live with national referendums, and there's likely to be more rather than fewer that will have implications. Although, again, I'm not sure we'll see as many in-out referendums as might have been predicted after Brexit, because I think the Brexit process itself is a living day-to-day laboratory in what it means to deglobalize and to leave the shackles of interdependence behind. And it's not easy. It's not easy.
So 3 concluding points from my side. First, I think the data is very interesting. I remember the data from SORA on the election day survey. They had a higher support among the young for the Freedom Party, if I'm not wrong. And this would be a stark difference, for example, to the electoral base of the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, which fares well particularly among the elderly. In most of the elections the AfD has competed in so far. And another thing I want to add is that, according to SORA, at least those who self-describe themselves as workers vote for the Freedom Party. The Freedom Party gained a majority among those who self-describe as workers. Second, I did not have the impression that the Green Party abandoned the issue of immigration and integration in the campaign. For example, they forcefully criticized the so-called burqa ban, which is implemented in a way that gained international media coverage from Die Zeit to the Financial Times. And the third point I wanted to make is social democracy, although they lost any position in power when it comes to coalition formation. Maybe it's important to add that they actually gained in absolute numbers 100,000 voters. They did not collapse as some other social democratic parties recently, but of course they are also in a crisis, maybe not as severe as the crises of other social democratic parties. And again, coming back to the voter base, one problem in the long term for the Social Democratic Party will be its very aging voter base. That's my 3 points.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a really interesting point, is kind of if it's reinforcing or counterbalancing. But I think looking at the Swiss experience and kind of how it also, the whole polarization in the party system triggered now into parliament, into policy making, even into the government, I would also no longer see it as this clear-cut kind of counterbalancing something. But they really use, also when you look at the whole process after, for example, their successful mass immigration initiative and how kind of they played the card of breaching the constitution, how that fed into their populist kind of sentiment and in this distrust into the government. So you're probably right that Austria was leading there in terms of the institutional structure, but I would not kind of see it as strong. But I really have to think, it's a super good point, I have to think about that much further. But what I imagine for Austria, if they have that, what the Swiss case shows is also that in parliamentary elections, there is a certain ceiling effect for the populist radical right with like 25–30%, but in referendum they can just do much better. And I think if you then had this kind of situation of, well, ultimately you still force a grand coalition to rule this country because they don't behave well in government, they would have then the tools to kind of also have this still, well, this is the consultation on element of grand coalitions, and we kind of have the people on our side. And I think then it would get closer, even though the institutions are very different to the Swiss experience. But yeah, it's, and I think no one will kind of call referendums probably on the in or out, but they will have more nasty questions for Europe on the direction of policy change.
Yeah, to make a concluding remark also from the lens of migration research, I would say, like, again, what this election has taught us, that it's identity issues that matter, not economic issues. Like very recently, Matt Goodwin, when he spoke about Brexit, is everything we focus on in this Brexit debate is about economics, but actually the vote, what it was about was identity. So I think, again, this is an issue we have to approach differently because identity matters more than economy. This is, again, a witness, like this election is a witness for this. Then again, also what I tried to underline in my presentation, that framing matters, and really that everything is approached from the perspective of migration at any sector. So I think this might be also problematic in the sense what we speak about, what we don't speak about. As I said before, like it really ignores the fact of legal migration, but in general, I think there is really this disjuncture about the reality of migration, what drives migration, what are the patterns of migration, and what drives migration politics. So really to think more about this disjuncture. And the third one is really about, for migration researchers and political party researchers, that we really have to stop talking about the radical right. Since 20 years, we do nothing than speaking about radical right, and we ignore, I don't say we have to stop, but we ignore the other parties. And I think this is also a witness of this Austrian election, that we have to think much more also about the other mainstream parties. Along also, of course, looking at the radical right, but not only and exclusively focusing on the radical right, because as also Sven said, migration is the major line. It's not anymore an exceptional issue.
And the last word goes to our guest and keynote speaker.
Just very quickly, although I mean, it's engaging in counterfactual tea leaf reading, but my sense is that the outcome was not a foregone conclusion. I think it's very much a framing issue, as evidence to submit the outcome of the presidential elections and the fact that the refugee crisis, quote unquote, happened actually before. So in many ways, there were major mistakes were made by the left or by those forces opposed to the parties who did very well. The Social Democrats weakened themselves through internal division. The Green, certainly in the current climate, it would be difficult for a party to be sort of pro-immigration and pro-Islam, put it that way, but you could have framed it as an open society, a tolerant vision, an optimistic vision of the future. I mean, the possibilities were there, and actually the better than expected performance by the Social Democrats is in some ways an indication that also that the courts plateaued at a certain level. So I think the opportunities were there, and it was simply also a good bit of campaign craft and mistakes that were made by other parties. And the outcome in that sense is unfortunate. But I take this also as an optimistic sign that we get these snapshots, but we shouldn't overinterpret the result either. Thank you.
Let's just give a last round of applause to all the speakers. Thank you also for staying with us.